It's kind of wild when you think about it. We're talking about a piece of technology smaller than your fingernail that has somehow become one of the biggest geopolitical battlegrounds on the entire planet, the advanced semiconductor. And look, this isn't just about what's in your phone or your laptop. This is a massive, high-stakes game for global power. The prize here isn't just winning in the market. It's about who gets to shape the future itself. So let's break down how we got to this point.
First things first, let's be super clear. We are not talking about just any computer chip. No. These are the absolute crown jewels of technology. These advanced semiconductors are the fundamental building blocks. They're the literal electronic brains that power everything we imagine when we think about the future. We're talking artificial intelligence, massive supercomputers, and the most sophisticated national security systems out there. The thinking is, if you can control these, you basically control the 21st century.
So, that's the big question, right? How in the world did we get here? How did this tiny little piece of silicon become the absolute focal point of this intense rivalry between the world's two biggest economies, the United States and China?
To really get our heads around the how, we've got to start with the why. And at its core, this is all about a battle for a technological edge for the future. It really all boils down to a fundamental tension.
Okay, so what's so fascinating about this slide is how clearly it lays out these completely opposing goals. On one side, you have the US, which wants to stay in the lead, and a big part of that strategy is to slow down China's ability to develop its own cutting-edge chips. A lot of this is driven by serious concerns over China's military-civil fusion policy. That's a national strategy where the line between commercial tech and military tech gets intentionally blurry. So an advanced chip sold for, say, a smart car could potentially end up in a military system. And then, on the other side, you've got China, with this long-held national goal of achieving total tech self-reliance by 2030. As you can see, these two ambitions are on a direct collision course.
So, faced with China's ambitions, the United States made its move. It started to construct what you could pretty much call a digital wall, using a series of export controls that just kept getting stricter and stricter.
This timeline really shows the escalation, step by step. It kicked off under the Trump administration, and the strategy then was to target specific companies, most famously Huawei. But I want you to notice the huge strategic shift that happened in 2022. The Biden administration stopped just targeting companies and started targeting the technology itself. They put these broad controls on certain types of advanced chips, and from that point on, the rules just kept getting tighter and more complicated. It really shows this pattern of constant one-upsmanship in a kind of digital Cold War.
So, the crucial point to get here is this shift in strategy. The early, actor-based controls, think of it like putting a single player in the penalty box during a hockey game. But the newer, technology-based controls, whoa, that's like changing the rules of the entire sport while the game is still being played. They don't just target one company, they restrict access to a whole category of advanced tech for an entire country, no matter who's trying to buy it.
But hey, whenever you change the rules of the game, you know the players are going to get creative. These US controls kicked off this incredibly intense, high-stakes cat-and-mouse game, with big corporations and China finding some really clever ways to adapt.
Okay, so let's look at the biggest player in this whole drama, NVIDIA. The US rules suddenly meant they were blocked from selling their most powerful, most profitable AI chips to the absolutely massive Chinese market. For a company like NVIDIA, this was a huge, huge business problem.
So in response to that first ban, NVIDIA did something pretty ingenious. They designed the A800 and H800. These were brand new chips engineered to be just powerful enough to fall below the legal performance limit, made specifically for the Chinese market. Then, when the US banned those chips a year later, what did NVIDIA do? Yep, you guessed it, they did it again, creating the H2O. It was like every time the US built the wall a little higher, NVIDIA would engineer a custom-made ladder to get right over it, all while technically following the letter of the law.
And it wasn't just NVIDIA playing this game. We saw a whole bunch of really creative workarounds. Huawei sold off its Honor phone brand, and suddenly, as a new, unlisted company, it could buy US tech again. Other Chinese firms reportedly just tweaked their chip designs to slide right under the legal limits, or they used these networks of unlisted design firms to get access to foreign manufacturing. The game was definitely on.
All right, so all of these workarounds pretty much forced US policymakers to respond. If the cat-and-mouse game was getting more complex, well then the traps had to become a lot more sophisticated. It was time to tighten the digital vice.
And this led to maybe the most ambitious proposal we've seen yet, the AI diffusion rule. The idea was to create a global, three-tiered system for who gets access to AI chips. Tier 1 countries, think close allies, would get free access. Tier 2, which was most of the world, could get access but only through licensed data centers. And then Tier 3, China, Russia, North Korea, they would face what's called a presumption of denial. It was basically a blueprint for unprecedented global control over this one piece of technology.
The whole point of this rule was to close the biggest loophole of all, indirect access. It was designed to stop China from just using cloud computing services or setting up shell companies in other countries to get its hands on all that AI horsepower it wasn't allowed to buy directly. And even though this specific rule was later pulled back, it gives you a really clear sense of the strategic direction things were headed.
Which brings us right up to today. After years of escalation, workarounds, and countermoves, Washington is now really grappling with this fundamental debate about the endgame. Where does all this lead? And what's the right move to make now?
And there are two very, very different schools of thought on this. On one side, you have people arguing to loosen the controls. They say, hey, selling slightly less advanced chips to China generates revenue that we can use to fund American innovation. And it keeps China dependent on our tech. But the gamble there is that you might actually be helping them get better faster. On the other side, you have people arguing to tighten the screws even more. They say any sale just fills China's technology gaps and that all these workarounds prove the current rules aren't nearly strong enough. The risk there, of course, is that if you cut China off completely, you might just force them to innovate on their own even faster, creating a powerful, independent rival down the road. It's a real dilemma.
This whole debate really came to a head with a super controversial decision in 2025. And as this quote shows, there was some serious concern when it looked like the US government was starting to mix national security decisions directly with making money.
And this number, 15%, this is what really got people talking. A deal was made where sales of certain advanced chips to China, like that NVIDIA H20, would be approved, but there was a catch. The US government itself would take a 15% cut of the money. It was a completely unprecedented move that just blurred all the lines between regulation and revenue.
All of this leaves us with one final big question. In this high-stakes, constantly escalating conflict over a tiny piece of silicon, is a clear win for either side even possible? Or does every single move, every control, every workaround, every countermove just reset the board for a new and even more complex round of the game?